Good day. This is CJ Miller, the host of the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Have you ever questioned what power flows through you when you make art? I did. For many years, I wondered, what is this? What is this feeling? Like, I feel like there's something greater than me coming through me. And that's why I wrote the book, The Spiritual Artist, because I outline the experience of that power. I think that every artist in their development gets to the point where they start questioning, where is this creativity coming from? How am I ignited with it? Well, I'm excited to unpack a book I read recently called The Way by Larry Jordan. And in the book, he examines all the different faiths, all the different faiths. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. But you, as an artist, are going to start developing your own theology. What makes you tick? How do you think the world runs? How do you think the creative process works? Stay tuned and listen to this great interview. Welcome to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. This is Chris Miller. I invite you to join me as I interview artists from a variety of disciplines. We'll share powerful stories and lessons learned while making their art. Good day, listeners. This is CJ Miller, the host of the Spiritual Artist Podcast. I think if you're an artist, at some point you start to question, where does this talent come from? How am I connected to something? Because I feel like this power is flowing through me. And so I sort of did that, as you know, if you've read my book, The Spiritual Artist. It is a process of me discovering that there is a greater power, and it flows through me when I make art. So I think an artist, as they evolve, um, they start to create what I would call their own theology, their own belief system. And so I'm really excited about today's interview. I met this man at a book signing. It was totally random. Talk about synchronicity. So I want to introduce to you Larry Jordan, and he has written this wonderful, wonderful book called The Way, and we're going to talk about that. But let's give you a little background of Larry. In 2011, he quit his big job in investment banking and he sold his big house on the hill to spend his life in service. And we're going to unpack what that means by service. But he drove veterans to the VA clinic. He prepared thousands of tax returns for low-income families. He taught school in Africa. He volunteered for the American Red Cross, all of these aspects of service. Over the last 20 years, he traveled around the world, and I think he was committed to his spirituality so much to creating this theology that he read over 1,000 books about spirituality. He had some powerful experiences, including baking in a sweat lodge, chanting in a shiva, and whirling with the dervishes. So I think he's tasted almost every different theology, and I can't wait to talk about his book. This book is called The Way: Meaningful Spirituality for a Modern World. It was a silver winner in the 2024 Nautilus Book Awards, and you can see I've got it all tabbed up with questions. So good morning, Larry. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm great. Thanks so much for doing this. I've been looking forward to visiting.
I have too. I think it's amazing, right? The synchronicity. You run into someone and then we start talking and it's like, yeah, 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 right? And um,
Exactly.
and I finished your book. I wanted to finish your book before we did this, but I'll be honest with you, I probably got about 20% of the way in. I thought, oh, this is great. This is a great topic. Um, I don't think a lot of people do this. I
No.
don't think a lot of people actually examine all the different choices they have in religion or spirituality. What made you do it? You know?
Well, I started out a long way from where I ended up. Like you, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. I was raised Catholic. Um, I had a little trouble on the way with some of the doctrine, but I went to Catholic church for a long time. And kind of in midlife, I was a conservative Republican. I was an investment banker. Um, but I started sort of asking the big questions, why are we here and where do we go when we die and what's the meaning and where do we come from? And I thought at the time, well, I'm sure I'm just going to confirm everything I was told in church, because hey, there's 2 billion people that believe it. There's 2,000 years of history. There's a book, for crying out loud. I mean, what could go wrong? And I wouldn't say anything went wrong, but I have to be careful with my wording here because I really leave room for people with other beliefs. But to me, I sort of discovered, hey, this stuff is not absolute, original, unchanging, revealed by God. That these religions they intermix, they import ideas from each other. The Western traditions are influenced by Greek philosophy. And so, a lot of the things that I thought were rock solid, and I'm talking about pretty fundamental things like, the Trinity, which is not explicitly in the Bible, original sin, which was developed 400 years after Jesus' death, substitutionary atonement, Anselm and Aquinas and people like that, 1,000 years after Jesus' death. So I just sort of thought, boy, I mean, I just thought I was really on solid ground, and not that this is all messed up, but it's just a little shakier than I thought it was. And so I went, yeah, um,
Yeah, so let me stop you because you just mentioned so much that people will want to talk to you about.
okay, yeah.
Um, so much. I don't think a lot of people realize today that the Bible itself is an assembled piece of different tracks, different writings. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it changed over time. If you read the four gospels in order, the first gospel, Mark, there's no virgin birth, there's no genealogy, there's no physical resurrection, post-resurrection appearance. And when they ask Jesus, are you the Son of God? He says, "Oh, don't tell anybody." It's called the Messianic secret. Well, by the time you get to John, which was, arguably 50, 60, 80 years after Jesus' death, speaking in long discourses, takes place in a different place. There's this idea of, originating even before creation. I'm the way, the truth, and the life, very exclusive. And so, yeah, it changed.
It's interesting, Larry. You said you were raised Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school. I went to South Catholic. And I was trained by brothers. We had
Mhm.
brothers
Yeah.
assisting us. And I had this very, now I look back, he was very forward thinking. He taught religion and we actually we reviewed all four gospels side by side. I mean, when you think about how progressive that was, because this is back in the 80s, 70s, late
Yeah.
70s, 80s, and he actually said, well, over here, a bunch of birds fly into the sky. Over here, a bunch of like it was always different. The story was so different. Or here, there was no sky. It was talking about the bread being multiplied, but it's the same story. It was the same sermon. So I want you to repeat something you just said because I think I was talking to my hairdresser, and so many people don't realize this. How many years after Jesus' death was the first gospel written? And then what were there around?
Sure, sure. I'm checking my book because I don't remember offhand. I'm going to say 50 years or so, but yeah. The Gospel of Mark was written 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew, 80 to 110 years. Luke, 80 to 100 years. John, up to 80 years after Jesus' death. So as I say in the book, this is like you or me writing a book about our great grandfather. I don't even know my great grandfather's name. I certainly couldn't recreate conversations that he had 80 years before. And, the Gospels are so different, you have to wonder, well, which is right? I mean, either Jesus had a pretty boiled down message, which was pretty much historically recorded in Mark, and then over the next 80 years, it was embellished by people like John. Or Mark, for whatever reason, left out all that good stuff. So did Matthew and Luke, and John recovered it somehow 80 years later. The related fallacy is that people say, well, I believe it because it was written by eyewitnesses. And we know who Luke was, and we know who Matthew was, and we know who Mark was. No, the books were written so late, and people's lifespans were not 80-year lifespans in the year 30 AD. Maybe they had 30 or 40-year lifespans. So it's virtually impossible that anybody could have written those books that witnessed the events, or that anybody who witnessed the events could have read the books and agreed or disagreed. So again, And the way I tell people to treat the Bible, it's a collection of all kinds of things, poetry and prose and stories and mythology and history, but it's not a history book explicitly.
Right. I think I read a wonderful book that says if we look at it as messages and eternal truths, it's a wonderful book. But if we try to say this is an actual fact, if we go with hard facts, when were those hard facts added? Some of the when was this formalized as a religion? Because I think you
Oh yeah. Pick up a book about Christian history, and it'll talk about Jesus. That's the first chapter, and then the second chapter is about the apostles and Peter and Paul, and then the third chapter skips ahead 300 years to the Council of Nicaea. And at the Council of Nicaea, that's Emperor Constantine called it, presided over it. The bishops came. They all voted on, hey, we can't have all these different beliefs. We can only have one belief. Now, I would challenge that. If I would have been at the Council of Nicaea, I would have said, well, why not? I mean, nobody knows. This is not history. It's mythology. It's really apologetic literature. It's evangelical literature. It's written by believers for believers. So, we ought to have a little leeway in what we believe. But anyway, a lot of the major doctrines were determined at the Council of Nicaea, including the really ambiguous treatment about Jesus. Jesus is both God and man. He has one nature that is both divine and human. Now, if you put your hand up, it said, well, I don't know. How do we know that? Maybe he has two natures. One is fully divine and one is fully human. No, that's heresy. I'm not sure I could explain the difference. Nobody can explain the difference. So, and then the Holy Spirit, he came along like in a council 50 years later where we say, oh, well, it's actually a Trinity. The Holy Spirit is God too. Now, as I read the Bible, I could read the Bible to say, well, no, Jesus, was a prophet, and the Holy Spirit is a divine messenger or a presence, like an angel or a spirit. But we don't say that prophets are divine, and we don't say that angels are divine. And I'm
no.
not absolute about any of this. And maybe I'll be surprised. I'll die, I'll show up at the gates of heaven, somebody will say, well, you got it all wrong. This is actually history. This is very literal. I don't know where you got all your crazy ideas. But the thing about my search, there was no sacred cows. There was nothing off the table. I was trying to follow, as I say, truth with a capital T, not the smaller truth in an individual tradition. And I fully expected I would confirm it, and I came away with more questions than answers. And that's not a bad thing either. And people get a false sense of security when they go to church, and they're told, well, let me tell you how the cow ate the cabbage. There's a Bible, it's history. There's a Trinity. There was original sin. We had this cosmic rift between God and man. Jesus restored the relationship. He physically rose from the dead. Well, can you imagine if somebody said, I think you ought to be our pastor? And I said, well, my first sermon is about, is there a God? And my second sermon is about, is God personal or supernatural or even intentional? And my third sermon is, well, was there a virgin birth or a physical resurrection? Is it essential to Christianity that we believe that? I mean, if somebody said, no, I don't believe that, but I'm really inspired by the words and works of Jesus, I'm a Christian. That's okay. I think
It's
that's
funny.
okay.
It's funny. When I was a kid, there were so many things that struck me as odd. I was raised, Catholic. I went to church, and you talk about like original sin. That just I was like, what do you mean original sin? They're babies. They're innocent. What? And the nuns would be up there and say, "Oh no, you're born in sin." I'm like, "You're born in sin? Who?" It struck me, Larry. It struck something deep inside of me that didn't resonate. And it wasn't my mom and dad didn't say that. It was just something that struck me as this is wrong. And likewise, Larry, I was told that I had to go into this little booth and confess to this man who then would talk to God. And I remember even very young thinking, well, why can't I just connect with God direct? Like, why can't I dial direct? What? Why is there another person? Why is there a person controlling the process? So what made you be willing to I think that's what I want to share with our listeners is hold everything lightly. Hold all this information with curiosity and lightly. But what made you willing to do that? You know?
That's a great question. I just want to know the truth. Once I became concerned that, well, that might not be right. Well, this might not be right. Well, if that's not right and this isn't right, then it's not right either. Um, it just started unraveling, and I really was looking for, well, how am I supposed to make sense of this? Um, Now I got kind of pulled out. There were three inquiries that were going on at the same time. I was reading about the mystics, people that have what they call mystical or peak or transcendent experiences, where they really believe that they've encountered what I call ultimate reality. It's a neutral term. Um, and those people, they encounter a oneness, a sense of benevolence, a sense of belonging, a sense that they have all the questions answered, that everything is just a-okay. But it's interesting what they don't encounter. They don't, if somebody says, well, what did God look like? Well, God's really not a person. Well, did you meet Jesus or the Holy Spirit? No, it didn't come up. Well, were you transported to heaven or hell? Did you see a vision of? No, I was right in the here and now. It's here as we speak. The second was Eastern religions, and I had a friend who told me, you really ought to look at this other stuff because the questions you're asking have answers in other places. And and so I started reading about Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism. And I thought this concept was so important, and I've really not seen it explicit anywhere else. I had a philosophy professor tell me, I wish I would have had your book when I was teaching philosophy. But there's a critical distinction. It's so important to me that I put as the first chapter of the book, just to let people know, hey, don't get all embedded in your assumptions. Don't think that there's one way of looking at it. Don't resist when somebody presents something else. And the something else is in the West, we say we're all about individuality, personhood, self, and soul. And I'm a person, God's a person, we have a personal relationship. I have personal responsibility. I'm concerned about my personal salvation. And in the East, they say, well, we're not all about individuality and personhood. And when you say person to me, the Buddhists say, well, there is no self, that what you think of as yourself. And clearly you have your own name, I have my own name. We're in two different locations, I might have a cold or whatever. But when you talk about yourself, it's really impermanent. And what you say as yourself is your chemistry, your conditioning, the result of things that you've done before or other people have done in your presence, some randomness, and maybe even some quantum entanglement. So, where I'm connected to everyone and everything around me, and there's forces acting on me I don't understand. So, so this idea of personhood seems to be a stumbling block. This is an Eastern person talking to a Western person. This seems to be a stumbling block for you. It seems to be the whole peg you hang everything on, and we don't consider it as essential as you do. Okay, now related to that, they say now all this mess about original sin, um, if there's a oneness, that's what the mystics see. There's a oneness. The whole idea that you and God are separated, it's just not even an issue. It's an impossibility. It's in the Eastern worldview something that couldn't happen. You say, well, what about sin? And in the East, they say, well, we don't. That's a Christian term. When Christians tell me everybody sins, well, everyone has shortcomings, but sin specifically means that you deviate from God's laws. And in the East, God has no laws. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a good way to behave. But in the East, they say, you know what? You're just supposed to do what's natural. You're just supposed to realize that everyone's related and everyone's connected, and you're supposed to behave accordingly. So if you're acting out of selfishness, you're first of all, you're being deluded. And second of all, you're probably not acting in accord with your oneness with everyone and everything. And so I'm thinking, well, that kind of confirms the mystics and it kind of confirms my questions about the Western worldview. So then the third thing I looked at was the science. And, people in science say it's 100 years old now. It's called quantum physics, and people know about it from things like the TV show, The Big Bang Theory. But but quantum physics is really it really changes things. And basically in Newtonian physics, think about the apple dropping from the tree. We're all discrete objects. We're all like billiard balls banging into each other. Things make sense when you just boil them down to their essence, which is atoms, and you aggregate atoms and you get things and people. But in quantum physics, it's like, no, 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 no. We're not discrete objects. If you tear apart an atom, there's like a lot of empty space. There's nothingness. It's all wiggling around. You can't even identify where things are. And we don't live as discrete objects. We live in a field of interconnectedness. And because of they've done experiments, for instance, where there's two particles that are quote entangled. For some reason, they've encountered each other and they interact. Then you separate them by an infinite distance, and you change the spin on one, and it instantaneously changes the spin on another faster than the speed of light. So somebody says, "Well, who's entangled? What's entangled?" Maybe everything's entangled. If the Big Bang was really a singularity where all the particles were in one place at one time, everything and everyone is entangled. And then quantum physics says, you can't look at this from the outside looking in. You are part of what you are studying. And so an explicit example is let's say that you shine an electron microscope at a particle to see how it behaves. Well, the mere fact that you shined an electron microscope on it means you moved it and you've affected its behavior. So you can just wipe out the word observer and replace it with the word participant. And then you can say, well, okay, but I'm still interested in studying this. So they did things like they studied light. And they said, is light a particle or is it a wave? So you roll out a wave machine and you study light and you say, oh, look at that. It's a wave. Somebody says, well, just to be sure, let's get the particle machine out here. And you study light in a particle machine, it's a particle. So all of a sudden it's like, hey, wait, there's ambiguity here. Things are not black and white. They're both and.
Yeah, I love this there's so much in this book, folks. Okay, so let's talk about that. I think it's Greg Brady or Braden. Is that Greg Braden that talks a lot about the quantum physics?
Okay.
Um, when I was trained at Center for Spiritual Living as in prayer, they very much review quantum physics because
Mhm.
it's that idea of entanglement. And
Yeah.
so, listeners, just to share this with you, which is really interesting, I probably did not believe in the act of prayer until I understood entanglement. And when I understood that we're all connected, I thought, well, why can't I set an intention for someone else's health? Why can't I, even though I'm not attached to them, even if they're across the world, I can hold an intention for healing for them or health, and it can affect them through quantum entanglement. So this entanglement. So when you talk about those experiments, I want to share this with the listeners and see if you agree with me. The intention, from what I understand, changes the outcome. Like what I in science, when I come to something and my intention is to notice one thing, it actually affects what I notice. Is that would you agree with that or what do you think?
Well, the way I would say it is the way I did that if you study things one way, you'll get one answer, and if you study things another way, get another answer. Yeah. And intention is I distinguish between prayer and intention. And to me, and I don't mean to split hairs, and
Oh no.
something comes out of it that I think is instructive. Um, if I speak in terms of prayer, I'm in relationship, I'm with something else. I've now identified myself and a universe. Now, and it's personal. No, when I talk about intention, that's the kind of thing I do in meditation. And meditation is impersonal. And I'm really listening more than I'm talking. Now, I really think that somebody asked me, well, do you believe in the efficacy of prayer? And they've done studies on it. And It's difficult because you have causation and correlation, and also it's difficult to replicate exactly the right circumstances, and also to isolate out the fact that something else might be going on. But they have done studies where intention, where a bunch of people get together and say, I hope that the crime rate in Jerusalem goes down this week, and it does. Now, the way I explain that is to say, to use my word, intention or meditation, or to use someone else's word, prayer. I think because everybody's related and everybody's connected, it's like we're all connected to the fabric of the universe, and we all start pulling in one direction, and something changes. And so I don't look at it, the distinction I'm trying to make is I don't look at it as some kind of external universe that intervenes because of intention or prayer. I look at it basically as the universe, all of us, basically answering our own prayers, responding to our own intentions, affecting the outcomes because we're looking at it in a certain way.
No, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I
I
thought you would, but some people kind of get,
when I said intention, I didn't mean that some external thing would do it. I
okay,
meant
yeah,
that
yeah,
my connection to the other, or actually my connection to myself,
there you go. Okay, yeah,
I
yeah.
can, through my connection to myself, I can actually warrant a shift, a
Yes,
shift.
I just think it's so important to just convey that difference between, my connection to something and my connection in something.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So I'm with you.
Okay. I thought so.
Okay, so we talked about, because I want the listeners to hear this. You've deconstructed your relationship to Christianity, but that doesn't mean you're throwing out the whole baby with the bathwater. Is that correct?
No, that's correct. Um, I tell people that I'm a follower of Jesus. And basically, I don't read things in the New Testament that give me concern about the person of Jesus. I mean, I don't believe everything that's been said about him, but I believe everything that he said. Um, Now, there are some things that he said, qualification. There are some things that he said that sound more like the author of the gospel than Jesus. So I read it a little bit loosely. I certainly agree with the Beatitudes and loving your neighbor and turning your cheek. There are things in the gospels, sort of go back to the earlier conversation. Mark, there's a passage where somebody says, "Hey, Jesus, those guys are teaching a different gospel." And Jesus says, if they're not against us, they're with us. Which again, Mark is the original gospel. I think it's more history than the other gospels. I think it's a more accurate reflection of Jesus. Well, the next gospel is Matthew. It was written mostly for Jews, and and early Jewish Christians, and it's more exclusive. So the same thing happens, and they say, "Hey, those guys are preaching a different gospel." And Jesus says there, if they're not with us, they're against us.
That's the
Now,
opposite.
yeah, the opposite. Just like there's places he said, well, when you go out there to minister, take a sword. And another place he says, when you go out to minister, don't take a sword. And so the apologists will say, well, maybe he said one thing in one time and one thing in another. I really don't think so. I think that the gospel writers got a little bit editorial. But anyway, I kind of read Jesus um, mostly relying on the earliest, more historical accounts, and I have no problem with Jesus. Now, I have a pretty eclectic spirituality at this point. I have a Zen practice, and the thing that attracted me partly to the Zen practice was that the teacher is a former Catholic priest. He's a Filipino man who was in his Jesuit studies in the 70s, went to Japan. And all the Jesuits in Japan in the 70s studied Zen. So he is still a practicing Catholic. He is no longer a Catholic priest, and he's a Zen master. And he's one of numerous people of his vintage that are all over the world teaching Zen. And I went looking for that guy because I knew that he understood the interspiritual aspects of this. And so where is he? He's in Dallas, Texas. He's 20 minutes from me. And, I would have gone all over the world to find this guy. But it's called the Maria Canon Zen Center. And Maria is in reference to Mary. And Kenan is in reference to Guanyin or Kenyan. It's different name in different languages. It's a Buddhist avatar of compassion. And so um, he's very interspiritual and, he's able to make these connections between different languages. Now, some people say to me, well, I don't get it. Are you an atheist or a Buddhist or a Christian? And I say, I don't really get it either. I mean, do I really have to choose? Right now, I my wife is on the board of an ashram, a Hindu ashram, and we participate loosely. I'll explain that in a minute. We participate at Unity of Arlington, where she leads one of their spirit groups, and she's the only person that's not a member of the Unity Church that leads a Unity spirit group. And I'm a member of a Unity spirit group. I'm teaching a course in the deconstruction of Christianity, largely based on the book, at a Unitarian Universalist church. I met this week with what they call the post-evangelical collective. It's a group of people coming out of evangelicalism that are trying to retain the good stuff and ditch the bad stuff and be more inclusive and more affirming. I I've met people through that group that are in the Quakers. And so I attend occasionally Quaker services in Fort Worth. So in all of these places, I want to be really clear about this. My wife's on the board. I'm leading a group where we are we are engaged. I don't mean to suggest to anybody, well, yeah, we kind of touch this a little bit and we dabble in that and we're syncretic and we put things together. No. We have a pretty broad and inclusive theology that basically says everyone's related and everyone's connected. And I'll show up any place that people embrace that. And I'll say to those folks, you know what? I like what you're doing here. I'm going to write checks. I'm going to show up. I'm going to do anything you ask me to do, but I'm not going to be a member because I don't really want to be exclusive. I really don't want to say to somebody, sorry, I can't really go. I'm a Quaker. That's really where my allegiances are. My allegiances, again, are to anybody that gets the point.
I hear you. I feel the same way. I consider myself an interfaith practitioner
Yeah.
because I don't even want to say seeker just because but it's a challenge though, isn't it? There are certain faiths that seem to think you're either with us or you're not, right? They go back to that quote. And if we can't all agree that we are all connected and that loving each other is important, I mean, as a society, as a world, right? Um, that's a big one, right? That one belief, you know?
Yeah, it's huge. I actually I wrote the book, and then to support the book, I also do a column on Patheos, which is a big religious platform, features all kinds of different denominations, and I'm in a corner called sort of you know, new ideas or more voices. Again, it's interspiritual. It's called You Might Be Right. I want to talk about that in a minute. Um, so anyway, I just wrote a column on exclusivism. And Christianity, you say some religions are like this. Christianity is like this.
Mm.
And when I say, it's kind of unique to Christianity, people say Islam is like that too. Yeah, it is. And Islam is kind of a sister religion. You don't want to think it is, but it is. Uh, but in the East, there's no Buddhist creed, there's no Hindu creed, there's no Taoist creed. Hindu is largely um, it's a biological identification. If your parents are Hindu, you're Hindu. If you're in India, you're Hindu. There's monotheistic Hindus, there's polytheistic Hindus, there are atheistic Hindus. We don't tolerate that kind of diversity generally in the West. There's not an exclusivism. My wife said they are interviewing her to be on the board of an ashram. She says, I love the ashram. It's really one of my spiritual communities. It nurtures me. But most of you are probably Hindus. You probably are in the Shaivite tradition. You probably um, worship the Divine Mother and you and Babaji. I'm not a devotee. I'm not a Hindu. I'm interspiritual. And the board said, that's awesome. we we need that kind of perspective on our board. Well, you don't have that. You couldn't be on the board of a Christian church and say, I whirl with the dervishes, I chant the Shiva sometimes. And uh, it's not evangelical. I mean, when's the last time that some Buddhist really put the heat on you and tried to tell you that you needed to meditate? When's the last time, that a Taoist said, "Hey, your ideas are all screwed up and mine are all right"? It doesn't happen. And I was on a call the other day. This is how bad it is. A guy said on the call, Christianity is really a bully religion, which is really, really a strong statement, but virtually everybody on the call said, yeah, it really is. It really is. So what I'm writing about recently in exceptionalism is, hey, if you want to tell me all about Jesus, I'm interested. If you want to tell me about your beliefs about Jesus, why don't you let me tell you about my beliefs about Buddha? And we can have a real conversation. Well, most people that evangelize me are not interested in a dialogue. They want a monologue. Now, the column that I write is called "You Might Be Right." And I wanted to illustrate, I want to tell you where that came from. I have a real good friend. He's a medical doctor. He was in my wedding. I've known him for, 40, 50 years. And he came to visit me in Crestone, Colorado, which is a real special place for me. And that's where the ashram is. And I have a lot of friends there of different traditions. And he said, "Tell me about your book." And I got about three sentences into it. He said, "No, no, 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 no. Not interested. I believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, and everybody but Noah and his family died in the flood, and the dinosaurs they lived with man until they were wiped out in the flood." I just took a deep breath and I said, "Well, gosh, I mean, we're at 8,000 feet above sea level. Do you really think the water got to 8,000 feet above sea level? And do you really, if it did, where did all that water come from? And where did it all go? And do you really believe that the kangaroos, for instance, doggy paddled all the way from Australia to the Middle East, took a cruise, and then doggy paddled all the way back? Didn't stop anywhere else on the way, didn't leave any evidence?" I said, I'm just not there. But then I said, and this is the important thing, but you might be right. I wasn't here 6,000 years ago. I wasn't here 13 billion years ago. If you say to me, well, my God can do anything, he can even do things that fool you to think it didn't really happen, I'm not going to argue with you. You might be right. He said, well, thanks, thanks, thanks. I said, now you say it. Say what? Well, tell me I might be right. It's a small concession. You weren't here 6,000 years ago. You weren't here 13 billion years ago. He said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just can't do it. I said, well, listen, I love you as a brother. I didn't think you could do it, but I hope you understand from my perspective, you didn't really extend the same grace to me that I extended to you. And you're really not as willing to admit that your beliefs are beliefs, not facts, as I am. He said, I get it, and I'm really sorry. Well, a couple days later, we're on the mountain, and I mean, we're at 11,000 feet, and you can see 50 miles to the north and 50 miles to the south and 50 miles to the west. And if you turn around to the east, there's a granite wall that goes up another 3,000 feet. And there's a drop that goes down to the valley floor. And he had an experience where he just sort of thought, my gosh, this is magnificent. And this is just one small slice of one great big universe. So we're down back sitting in the backyard smoking cigars and drinking scotch and looking at the mountain. He looks at me out of the blue. He says, "You might be right." And listen, um, nobody's crowing about that. Nobody's groveling. Nobody's saying I win or you lose, or it's just like that's grace. Thank you. I might be right. You might be right. Nobody knows. We shouldn't pretend that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Sometimes it takes, I think when we share conversation with people, sometimes we have to understand that it might take years before they actually hear it. Or in this case, a day or two for you, where he let it spin around in his head. I went to a neuro my neurologist yesterday, and he was giving me a test from some back pain, and he had time to talk to me, which is very unusual for someone. And
Yeah.
he says, "What do you do?" And I explained to him, "Well, I teach creativity as a spiritual practice." And I'm very keen on watching people's face and all. And he's a scientist. He's using these electropulsing things to detect nerve cell damage in my legs. And so I said to him, um, "You must be real into science." First, I asked him what his faith was, and he was raised Muslim. And then I asked him, I said, "You must be really into science." And he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "So what I believe," so I tried to put my definition into
Yeah.
his reality. I said, "I believe that system, our bodies, the earth, the planets, the stars, the spinning of the earth, the beautifulness of how our body works is all, and that there's an intelligence there. And I believe that intelligence can guide us when we make art, when we create through life." And so to me, that's my spirituality, is honoring that essence. To me, that is God, that power. And he just lit up, Larry. I mean, he
Yeah.
up until that point, he was being his very stodgy doctor kind of, and then he starts telling me, yeah, and he starts explaining how electrons divide and how they move and break up, and how there's a self-healing mechanism in the body, and how they age naturally, that there's a natural aging to our bodies. And he got so lit up, and he turns to me and goes, "I understand exactly what you're teaching."
That's awesome. I have a similar story. Jill and I went to the Arctic, to a place called Svalbard, which is halfway between the European continent and the North Pole. And we went with a group that specializes in this, but it was enhanced. It was sponsored by a British science magazine called New Scientist. So they put a bunch of their own scientists on the boat, and they put what they called a rock star scientist on the boat. And his name is Richard Dawkins, and he's an evolutionary biologist and a prominent atheist. And so I told Jill, I said, well, this could be some rough sledding. I mean, I've seen the guy before. I'm not sure that he's really spiritual, and he's a little prickly, but so I made it a point to get to understand more what I was getting into. And I started reading Richard Dawkins. I started watching him. And Richard Dawkins is a self-described a spiritual in the way that Einstein was spiritual. And Einstein says I'm spiritual in the way that Spinoza was spiritual. And there and And the reason that Richard Dawkins is prickly is because so many obstinate people want to insist that he's going to hell. Um, but he's actually a very reflective person. So the first talk on the boat was about awe. Think about that. And so the whole time we're in the Arctic, we're seeing this majestic wildlife, just wild landscapes, um, polar ice, and these scientists keep using words like mystical. Isn't it mystical out here with the fog and the snow and the ice and the water? And there was a real spirituality to it, even though it was not supernatural. Now, I actually had an opportunity to eat dinner with Richard Dawkins and his wife. And I asked him two questions that I was really interested in. I said, uh, because he had explained to his mother one time, and I knew this about him, this cell phone is amazing and it picks up information from all around us, just like our brains might pick up information from all around us. So I'm having dinner with him and I said, tell me more about that. And he lit up and he said, our brains are so small. The universe is so large. Wouldn't it be amazing if we were living in the Matrix? And so science, you realize, is skeptical, but it's also inquisitive and curious. And people like this are not afraid to ask the big questions. The other thing I asked them was about transcendence. I said, I'm interested in transcendence. People get there through meditation and prayer, but they also get through hallucinogenic drugs, strokes and seizures, experiences in art, nature, and music. Um, he lit up again. They actually hooked me up to the God helmet, and they stimulated my brain so that I would, have a mystical experience. And he said, I'm one of the 20% of the people I'm not responsive. And he says there was an Anglican vicar with me, he said he wasn't responsive either, but the scientist told me, no, I think he really did get one. Why would he, why would he not admit to that? And my answer was, this is not Dawkins talking, but my answer is, well, if somebody said, hey, did you have a God experience? And they say, no, I didn't. I didn't meet the guy with the beard. I didn't meet Jesus. I wasn't transported to heaven. You know, it's all in the here and now. It's just not, it wouldn't be recognized as such. But I came away from that interaction, from the whole trip. Oh, and then the last talk was by Dawkins, and it's called the beauty of science, the science of beauty. And so I came away from that trip thinking, these are a bunch of atheist, secular, scientific people. They have awe, they have reverence, they have a sense of wonder, they have gratitude, and they feel the other overwhelming impression from that trip is climate change is real. It's right on top of us, and the people that are trying to sound the alarm, they're not being heard. But the scientists, they have a sense of responsibility for that. They feel like, hey, we got to tell people, again, everyone's related, everyone's connected. We got to do something about it. And so it was really it was a life-changing experience. And it just, in some ways it was affirming, in some ways it was challenging, but that's what it's about to me.
Yeah, there's geez, Larry said so much I could respond to. Okay. Okay, so let me just respond to something that I think.
Okay.
That I think, and I don't know if I'll be honest with you, I don't know if you really addressed it in your book with science. Um, I think the biggest challenge to all of these dogmas, faiths, whether it's the West or the East or science, or atheism, is what I would call certainty. This certainty, this sense of righteousness. Um, I had a conversation with another doctor a couple weeks ago, and he was just, this is how it is. Like, I study the body, and I'm thinking, oh, you understand everything about the body already. Great. It's taken millions of years to evolve, but you got it down, man. And so a scientist should always keep that sense of curiosity. Maybe I don't know it all. The space, like you talk about, the space for God. And likewise, any person studying a traditional religion, keep that sense of certainty in control, because you don't know. You are not all that is. You don't have absolute truth.
Yeah,
And it's that certainty that's so, and it's in all of the faiths. And I will align with you and say, that's why I cannot commit. I'm like you. I actually considered going on and being a minister, but I can't just toe the party line, as they say. And unfortunately, the minute you identify, the act of identifying oftentimes limits you. When you say, I am this, suddenly you're saying, and that's not, right? I mean, in a way.
exactly. Yeah. It strikes me. I read your book, Spiritual Artist, and I really liked it. And I was struck by some of the common ideas, and we even quote some of the same people and use some of the same terms. It's really spooky. Um, but I was an artist when I was in the investment banking business. And what I mean by that is, I had to be creative. I had to figure out, well, how do I get from here to there? And I would have to ask things like, can I borrow money and uh, and pay it back this way? And they say, well, you can't do a bond payment, but you can do a lease payment. If you style it as a lease, you can do exactly that. So there was all these time. I only got paid if I closed, so I had to figure out how to close. And the first part of that was I had to see whether there was a deal on the table or whether it was just a fictional idea in somebody's mind. Just like an artist looks at a block and says, is there a statue in there or not? I mean, if there's a big cut through the rock, I don't think I can carve a statue, but this particular rock, I think there's something inside of it. And I had to look at fact patterns that way. And then I also had to look at, well, how am I going to close? Do I have to go around? Do I have to go right through it? Do I have to go underneath? Do I wait? You know, do I try to change the law or the minds of the people involved? And so there's the common theme between the work that I did and the writing that I do now and the art that you do is that we're holding things up to the light and we're turning them around and we're asking questions, we're listening, we're trying to look at things in the most God's eye view instead of Larry Jordan investment banker view. And and I also kind of want to assure people, and I see it in you, and I hope people see it in me. I think somebody could hear about me. Not too many people do hear about me, but somebody could hear about me and say, I don't know. The guy sounds confused. He sounds cynical. Maybe he's nihilistic. He doesn't know what to believe. Let me tell you something, friend. I I am transformed, and the reason I wrote the book, I didn't set out to write a book. After my journey was largely, was as almost to, today, just a few years ago, my kids sat me down and said, "What happened to you?" I said, "What do you mean? You are a different person. And, you used to be this single-minded investment banker. Now you're this open-hearted, open-minded guy. Whatever you did, you need to tell people about it and they need to start doing it." And I said, I couldn't tell you in a sentence. I said, I've read 1,000 books. I've chanted to Shiva. Throwaway comment. I said, I have to write a book. And my kids leaned in and said, you need to write that book. And so that's where the book came from. And today, my politics are different. My spirituality is different. My personality is different. There's people, I was at a book event the other day and a guy comes up and looks me on the face and says, you don't remember me, do you? I said, no, I remember you. We used to work together 20 years ago. And he's looking at me like, the hell are you doing here? You got a freaking ponytail. You wrote a book about spirituality. I mean, what happened to you? But I'll tell you, I have joy in my life. I have meaning in my life. I cry more. I laugh more. I'm not in some kind of spiritual wasteland. I'm like submerged in spirituality. And you know, I give you one example. I talked about the ashram. So you go to the ashram for a fire ceremony, and the fire ceremony is like the most ancient religious ceremony that exists. And so you're on this mountain. The sun is shining. That you're at 8,000 feet. There's trees. The wind is blowing. You sit in front of the fire. Now I've been there sometimes in the snow. You sit in front of the fire and you're getting pelted with snow. You think, man, this is like sensory overload. And then after the ceremony, where you're expressing gratitude, you're calling out the names of the Divine Mother, all the feminine aspects of God and all the different manifestations. Then they go into the temple and they chant. And so I'm sitting on the floor. There's music, there's chanting, there's women in saris dancing around me. I can feel the wind from the sari. I'm just immersed in a spiritual experience. And listen, when I chant to Shiva, I pray the Our Father, although I don't think that there's a man with a beard. I chant to Shiva, even though I don't think that there's a literal Hindu god of destruction. But I honor ultimate reality in that way. I'm in a place where people are expressing awe and gratitude and reverence. They're open to ultimate reality, my neutral term for what everybody calls their own thing. And I'm in it. I'm just thinking myself, there is no better place to be than right here, right now. And so I really sort of challenge people to um, ask some questions, hold things up to the light, turn them around, open yourself to different ways about looking at things. And you really, it's okay to say, I don't know. Or now that I see 10 different ways of doing things, I don't know which one I embrace.
Mm.
Do you know that everyone's related and everything's connected? That's all you need to know.
Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful summation of the whole conversation. But I still have questions. So
Okay.
I want to ask. So you talk about transcendence.
Yeah.
Can you give the listeners what your just definition of transcendence is?
Yeah. I'll talk about my wife, Jill. She had a mystical or peak or transcendent experience where we were in the forest in Costa Rica. We're in front of a waterfall, and all of a sudden, boom! She is transported, not any place, but to the here and now. And instead of the awareness that she's with me and we're looking at water in Costa Rica, she sees things on a granular level. She doesn't really realize where her hand begins and where everything else ends. She says something reminiscent of something I've heard you say, that her impression was that God was in the space between, and that everything was all right, and that she was connected to everyone and everything. And she would rather live in the vision of the world that exists right then than she would rather go back home and live in Dallas, Texas and cook eggs for breakfast. It was just, it's something that stays with you. Now, I didn't know that was happening. I just noticed she was kind of caught up in the waterfall. And I said, come on, it's time to go. Boom, she's out of it. And it's a little bit, why'd you do that? But she didn't say a word. So 20 years later, and my wife a little bit, she would be a good guest too. But uh I have an experience all the time where, I'm reading a book and I think, oh my gosh, I have this new, understanding, and I slam it down. I say, you're never going to believe this. And I tell her, and she says, yeah, I kind of always thought about things that way. So it takes me I take the long way. So, so I'm reading about the mystics and this really transcendent experience. And I put the book down and say, you're not going to believe what happens to some people. And there's a tear coming out of her eye. She says, it happened to me. It happened to me in Costa Rica. It happened to me again in Switzerland. I know exactly what those people are talking about. And I'm glad you told me what it was, because I never knew. I knew it was a sacred experience. I didn't associate it with God or religion or anything else. I just thought, man, oh man, there's something here that's here all the time that we don't see. Now, I recommend two things to people. One is a book, but I would rather watch the video. The video is really compelling. It's called My Stroke of Insight, and it's by a neuroscientist named Jill Bolt Taylor, who had a stroke in the left side of her brain. Now, the right side of your brain is creative, intuitive. That's where we like to live. And the left side of your brain is analytical. I got to pay the bills. It's almost time for my meeting. So she had a stroke in the left side of her brain. She had transcendent experience. She doesn't say, I saw God, it was mystical, but she says, I understood that there's two aspects of reality. And this is reflective of the Eastern traditions. There's an absolute emptiness or formless in Buddhism, fullness in Hinduism, and there's also the relative realm where we seem to be different people. Taoism, they call it the Tao, absolute, and the 10,000 things, relative. So she says, I see two aspects of our world. I see this really deep interconnectedness, this this sense of benevolence, of comfort. And I also see that, hey, I'm a neuroscientist. I study this stuff. I'm having a stroke. I need help. But it expresses a transcendent experience, not in woo-woo language, but in scientific language. Now, the other thing that's a really good read, and it can get a little heavy, is called the Tao, T-A-O, the Tao of Physics. Maybe a 40 or 50-year-old book. The guy says, if you study the Eastern religions and you the mysticism, and then you study the new physics, you see that they're really not that one is defining the other or that one validates the other, but they really talk about parallel things and they intersect. And it's really it's the one book to go to in one place where you kind of get the message I got of the mystics and Eastern religions and the scientists. They're telling us the same thing. And if you saw the book, the movie or the book Oppenheimer, you know that the quantum physicists of 100 years ago were reading the Eastern scriptures. And the atomic bomb project was called the Trinity Project. And and when the bomb goes off, Oppenheimer says, "I am destroyer of worlds." Well, there are people that think, yeah, the Trinity's everywhere. That was the Christian Trinity. I wonder why they named the bomb after it. Well, no, it's not. It's the Hindu Trinity. And he's quoting Shiva, the god of destruction. And so these intersections of the science and the Eastern spirituality are really, really compelling. And to the point where I'd say, if you haven't explored it, if you're if you're not aware of it, you should look at it. And uh, there's things about the inner spiritual journey that bring you back to where you started. I'll give you a perfect example. I'm talking to a friend of mine. He's a rabbi. He's also a Zen practitioner. I say, here's what I love about Zen. It's all about the connectedness. It's all about lack of separation. And I go back to Genesis in Judaism and Christianity. It's all about separation. God and man, plants and animals, water and air, you know. And he says to me, well, I think of it a little differently. You know, they use the term void in Genesis, which is also a term we use in Buddhism. And I think what's really going on in Genesis is in Buddhism what we call formlessness or emptiness becoming form. And in the Heart Sutra in Buddhism, we say emptiness is form, form is emptiness. And you know, I just got slack-jawed and I was like, well, thank you for educating me. I mean, you know, I like your answer better than my answer, you know. But it gives you a sense that I didn't tear up the Bible. I didn't say, well, you can just reject everything you ever learned in church, but I have a different perspective on it. And also, I come back to Catholicism. What I realized when I studied all these religions is, Catholicism it had a lot of toxic doctrine and still does, and it's almost impossible to change. But underlying it, there's a sense in Catholicism that your conscience is really your guide, and it has to be primary to any doctrine or any teacher. And also that there's an essential part of our life that's supposed to be about spiritual justice and immigrants and poor people. And when you say I'm doing good things for people, it's not works. It's not hollow. It doesn't mean that you lack faith. And that Catholicism has a mystical tradition. That in the early years there were people that asked these kinds of questions. That had transcendent experiences. Now, if you say to your friend, I had a transcendent experience, you say, well, you better go talk to the priest, see if it was the real deal. And I'm sure the priest will ask you, did you see God? Did you see Jesus? Did you go to heaven? No. Well, then that wasn't the real deal. Well, it was the real deal. you know.
It's all very interesting. I'll tell you, when you talk about formless to form, that's pretty much the background to my book. Because when I use the word spiritual, I'm not talking about a noun. I'm talking about this this space before creation. So when I say the spiritual artist, it's someone that before you create, or even while you create, you are always aware of the consciousness, the essence, the space before it, and what's leading into it you know Fascinating discussion. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you'd like to share with our I will say there's so much that we haven't even talked about, but is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we end this?
Um, no, I think this has been great. And your last paragraph there was just beautiful. The emptiness and the form and the space before creation. I just think that's a great wrap up. Just a sales pitch, I have a book called The Way. It's on the wall behind me. Um,
Uh-huh.
it's and you probably picked up on this. It's really an easy book to read. It's short sentences, short chapters. Um, there's a lot of white space. Um, I had really good editors. I had a professional editor, but I also had my family who was actually maybe more on point. And they'd say, "Well, I don't even recognize these terms you're using." So there was a lot of simplification, so that you don't have to be a quantum physicist to appreciate the book. Um, so the book is out there. I just recorded an audio book. So for people that listen to books, that'll be out in the next few weeks. It's called The Way, Meaningful Spirituality in Modern World. You can get it anywhere. Now, I have you might be right, column on Patheos. So you can sign up to get my writing. You can go check it out. It writes in the spiritual vein. It's about a lot of the things we've talked about here. I go to author events all the time. It's a great book club book. It's got a study guide in it. It has recommendations for other readings. There's a book club in Australia that's doing it now, and they are heavily engaging in it and sending me questions and comments. And well, we got a guy. He gets what you're saying, but maybe you should have talked about indigenous spirituality. I'm like, maybe I should have, but thanks for taking the book so seriously. So it's a great study book. I I tell you, it's just like you and I. I mean, maybe we met 3 weeks ago. I feel like I've known you for 30 years. Um, I love doing stuff like this, and I so much appreciate what you're doing. I think your whole deal, with the classes and the retreats and the books and the teaching is just it's really singular. And I'm really glad to know you, and I really appreciate having a chance to talk with you.
Well, I thank you. This has been a great. Like I said, I will say, listeners, there's so much in this book, but it is a great book. If you are deciding about what your spirituality should be, what your theology is, creating your own theology, this is a great starting point because it gives you just enough information. Like you said, Larry, you edited it down nice. It's not because each one of these chapters could be in a book this big. And so it is a nice abbreviated version. I think I'm actually going to get a copy from my friend actually my cousin who's an atheist, because it shows you the good and the bad. There is both in everything, the good and the bad of all theologies. And there's limitations to all of them. There's
Yeah.
even, I think I relate to Buddhism, but there's a limitation to Buddhism. So anyway, I want to thank you all for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Remember that I have a new book coming out as well called Spiritual Parable on September 8th, and it's short stories. I've tried to take out all the theology and just talk about the spiritual truth. So when you read a story, I want to remind you of a spiritual truth without any of the dogma. So you might consider that as well on your journey. So go out there and keep reading, keep learning, keep being curious, most important, and be a spiritual artist. Thanks. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Whether you're watching this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or iHeartRadio, make sure you choose the subscribe button so that you will receive updates when new segments are released. Most importantly, be still, listen, and know that you are a spiritual artist.